Hello, I'm Joe Chamberlain, the Executive Director of the Coastside Land Trust located in Half Moon Bay, California. We're delighted to have a presentation today about bats. But before we get on to that, I'd like to give you just a little logistics of how the program will go. We'll have our presentation and then there will be a Q&A for about 15 minutes at the end. If you have a question, at the bottom of your screen on your deck, it says Q&A. Click that on and enter your question, and then we will get to you in turn after the presentation. A couple of other things is a copy of this webinar will be sent to you in your email as a link for you to enjoy later or share with others. It will also be on our website. So at any point you can go there and view it again or share it with others as well. We very much appreciate your ongoing support. It's because of your passion and your caring for the environment and your support of the work we're doing here at the Land Trust that we're able to continue with these programs. Thank you so much. And we appreciate each and every one of you, and especially your passion that we share. So today we have Nat Goodby of the PacWest Bat Hub, where he is a coordinator. He's an educated wildlife biologist and has become fascinated with bat conservation. And one of the things that Nat mentioned when we were discussing his presentation is how much we don't know, still do not know about bats. And fortunately for us, we're going to have an opportunity to learn some of the secrets and mysteries and look forward to others in the future. Nat, could you tell us a little more about you and your organization before you start your presentation?
Sure thing. Thanks, Joe. Well, I'm really glad to be here, and hopefully you can all hear me well. And I'm excited to talk a little bit about the mysterious world of bats. I work with Bat Conservation International, and we do all sorts of things bats across the world. So we're focused on, I'm personally on the science team with BCI, Bat Conservation International, and what the science team works on mostly is trying to find scalable solutions to help bats. So we do research projects and try to publish papers about treatments and ways of conservation approaches that can help bats, and try to get other partners to take those on as well and scale those solutions. So that's kind of my work. And then BCI also does, some more traditional like land trust style work where we acquire properties and protect certain areas strategically to help bat habitat and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm like Joe said, I work as the PacWest Bat Hub coordinator, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that is later on. It's part of the North American Bat Monitoring Program, so it's a big nationwide effort to know more about the bats, and I think it's a good place to start here. Let's see if I can just get to my next slide, because like Joe said, so little is known about bats. So we can see, I'll give you a sense in a second of how many bat species there are in the world, but this little bar chart just shows most of our bat species, we just don't know what's going on with them. We don't have a good sense of, are their populations increasing, decreasing, are they stable? And there's just a lot we don't know. And obviously you can imagine that's partly because they come out at night, they're hard to monitor and track, they live in hard to reach places, they're all over the world, there's tons of species, there's just a lot still to learn about bats. And I put this New York Times article up here because just recently, last spring, this article came out about a BCI effort where we found a new species in West Africa. And it's kind of a cool story because I feel like in this day and age, it's very rare that new species are identified without genetic testing and genetic work. And what I mean is, as soon as the research scientists who found this bat on our team saw it, they knew it was a new species. And that sort of thing is really rare in today's day and age. So usually when people find a new species, it's after they take a sample of the tissue back to the lab and do some genetic testing and figure out that the genome is different enough to separate that species from one that we already know. But in this case, as soon as the bat was in their hands, they knew it was a new species. And that's pretty amazing, and I think speaks to, how much more there is to learn about bats still, that we're still finding new species that, we didn't know were out there. So I'm going to start with just a little bit about bats. This is a photo you can see in the skeleton. Bats, their wings are giant hands with elastic skin stretched on their fingers. And you can see here, its little thumb kind of pointing out on top. And you can really see it in this photo as well on this long-legged myotis. And what I'm going to try to do is, I'm going to try to just dribble in little bits about the bat species we have here in California and some of their ecology. And so, for examples, as I talk about bats more generally, I'll try to use some local examples. And this long-legged myotis is one of our California species. They're especially dependent on wooded habitats, and they're usually found at kind of higher elevations from 4,000 to 9,000 feet, but a really cool species. So that's one of our local California species. But not only do they fly, I thought I would just share this video. It's a little surprising, but another way that bats move around the world, this is a vampire bat moving on the ground. And I think it's just another example of something unexpected about bats that, when I saw this video, it's pretty mind blown about, it's kind of unbelievable that they would travel like that. In addition to being able to fly, obviously they're the only flying mammal, but this is a pretty amazing video of bats moving around the world in another way as well. And like I said, bats, they're widespread. They're on all continents except Antarctica. If you look at this pie chart, this is the mammal orders of the world. So the number of species in each order of mammal. And about 20 or 25% of all mammal species are bats. And so that's this red slice in this pie chart. And the bigger one here, the big blue, is rodentia. So that's like lots of little, rats and mice and that sort of thing. Also an extremely diverse order, but bats are up there with 1,400 species. And it does, it makes you wonder, like, what are they doing? How are they so successful? How have they differentiated so much across the world? How is there so much diversity? And so this just goes back to that. There's so much to know about bats and still so little that we do know. So still lots to learn, 1,400 and still more species being discovered, as I mentioned. So the bats of the US, we have about 47 resident species in the US, and most bats are insectivorous, meaning they eat insects. And that's true in the US as well. So we have primarily insectivorous species. We also have 3 nectarivorous species, which means they feed on the nectar of plants. So we'll talk a little bit about this, but bats can also be important pollinators because of that. And a sad reality of the bats of the US is that there have been widespread population declines. And so I'll get into this a little bit later as well, but there have been a couple threats to bats that have really started to affect their populations. And from what we know about it, we're seeing a lot of bad indicators in terms of those populations declining. But also, like I said, still just a lot of work to do in terms of understanding what's really going on with those populations, because bats have been historically hard to kind of keep track of their populations, as they, it's hard to get good counts as they fly around. They can have big territories, they migrate, they have complicated behavior. So still learning about that, but we have, some challenges in terms of bat conservation in the US ahead of us. And in terms of bats of California, we have 25 species here. Similarly, mostly insectivorous. And then we have 1 nectar feeding bat. And I would say in California, less is known than, say, on the East Coast, where there's been a bigger effort to count bat colonies to date. So yeah, we still have a lot to learn about the population status of many of our species. And just continuing with kind of some local species here, this photo is a long-eared myotis. And so this bat is found mostly in coniferous forests, and really beautiful photo of it there, coming in for a drink of water. Just to give a little bit more of a sense of the diversity of bats here. This is the world's biggest bat, the giant golden crowned flying fox. This is a bat that is endemic to the Philippines. And this bat actually eats fruit. So, it lives in trees, it eats fruit. It's I think I have another photo later on of it roosting in a tree, and you know, an amazing looking bat. That person there on the right gives a little bit of reference to the size of this bat. I wanted to show this bat as well. This is the greater bonneted bat, which I put here because it's our largest bat in the US, and this bat's wingspan can approach 2 feet. You might also hear it called the Western Mastiff bat. It's interesting because this bat can be very limited by available drinking water. So it has very long, narrow wings. And because of that, it has a hard time drinking in ponds that are less than about 100 feet long. So when it comes in to drink, it kind of needs a pond as a runway to pick up a drink of water that's at least 100 feet. And as you can imagine, you know, a lot of the droughts in the West here have been a challenge for this bat. And so it's no longer found in many of its previously occupied areas. And another bat where we just don't know. So it may be endangered, but we just have too few past and present observations to know exactly what the status of this bat is. And on the other end of the spectrum, here's the smallest. This is called the Kitty's hognose bat. So also amazing. You can see just the hand for reference there, just to give a little sense of the kind of spectrum of bats that are out there. This is kind of interesting. You can see that for most species, we expect a relationship between their longevity and the size of their body. And that's the graph on the right, kind of shows that relationship. And bats break this rule. So typically the smaller you are, the shorter you live. But bats live almost as long as elephants, if you account for their body mass. So this bat, Myotis brandii on the left here, they've documented bats at least 41 years old, even in the wild, with this bat, which is pretty amazing. And we have longevity of more than 20 years documented for more than 20 species and more than 30 years for at least 6 species. So extremely long-lived animals, no matter who you are, but especially as such a small animal, it's kind of cool that they break this rule and somehow have adaptations that have let them live super long, even though they're so small. And so there's a lot of researchers who are interested in this and just asking that question of, you know, what's going on with the bat anatomy that lets them be healthy for so long. So some good questions to ask about longevity and aging, looking at bats as well. Let's see, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ecological roles of bats and the importance of bats. And this is one that gets brought up a lot. It's, you know, it's very easy to understand that bats, they eat pests, they eat insects, as I mentioned. And like I said, about 70% of the world's bats are insectivores. And so this is a paper that I show because it was a study that showed that US farmers save about $23 billion annually in not having to use pesticides, and because of the work that bats do eating insects and pests. You know, kind of cool to put a number to that and try to understand what a big difference those species make. So yeah, they, you know, for our California species, this species called the Mexican free-tailed bat, those bats have been shown to eat up to 70% of their body weight each night, and they eat insects. So bats can just put away a ton of food. And that's primarily insects, which obviously has huge benefits for us in terms of agricultural and pest reduction. This is a cool photo of a pallid bat, another local bat species. In this photo, it's chewing on a scorpion. So it's just showing kind of like how, you know, these bats can eat some big insects, even for their body size. And I think this pallid bat is also a good little segue to, I wanted to talk a little bit about the bats as pollinators. And this is an interesting bat because we didn't think it was a pollinator, but recently it has been observed to be drinking cactus nectar and pollinating cactuses. So I think there's a lot of, like I said, like bats doing behaviors out there that we don't even know about. So they're hard to account for. But like I said, so that pallid bat does drink cactus nectar, and there's other bats as well. This is a photo of a Mexican long-nosed bat, and bats are the primary pollinator for tequilas. So this is kind of like a fun bat fact, but that's a photo of the agave plant on the right, which is the plant used to make tequila. And if you've ever had mezcal, which is a really smoky tequila, it's kind of a dark brown color. That drink is made from a wild agave. And so we are harvesting these wild agaves, and that's another thing that BCI has been working on, is how do we maintain these corridors of agave plants so that bats can continue feeding on them, and also equally importantly, pollinating them so that the agaves continue to reproduce and be healthy in the wild. And it can be a little bit hard to imagine how a bat pollinates something, but I think these photos do a pretty good job showing what can happen to the bat's face when it gets into some pollen. And on the right here, I'll try to get this little video to work of just some live action of a bat going in for a drink. So this is, again, the Mexican long-nosed bat, one of the bats that pollinates those agave plants. This is showing our 3 nectar feeding species that I mentioned that we have in the US. And we do have one of these leptonicteristes that we think comes into California. So like I mentioned, there's that one species in California that does drink nectar and contribute to this pollination, but mostly insectivorous bats in the US and in California, like I mentioned. Just to give a little sense of where are these bats living, I think that's, we obviously think of bats as living in caves. I think that's an obvious one, but I wanted to show also some other examples of where these bats spend their time and where they sleep and where they hang out. And this photo is a photo of the Bracken Cave in Austin, Texas. And I put it on because this is a BCI owned property. Super important, one of the largest bat colonies in the US, if not the largest. Tons of Mexican free-tailed bats, which we also have here in California, like I mentioned. So cool photo of them emerging in the evening. But bats also roost in trees. So this is on the left, those flying foxes, that type of bat, again, roosting in a tree. And in North America, we have lots of tree roosting species. I'll show you a couple here in a second that are local to our area. On the right, I had to poke around and zoom in to see where the bats were, but those little things that look like bark scales kind of running straight down are actually bats, and you can see their little hands and wings kind of reaching out to the sides and their faces pointing down, but amazing camouflage from those guys. Not all bats need live trees. One thing we'll see is that some like to take advantage of snags and crevices in old or dead trees. So snags are just dead trees, but the trunk and the branches are still there, even though it no longer has leaves. And so this is another thing that's become important in bat conservation, is thinking about how do we keep those snags in an ecosystem, as we log it, making sure to leave some of that habitat so that bats can continue to use those old snags, which are important habitat features for lots of animals, not just bats, but for nesting birds as well. Let's see, these are 2 examples of local tree roosting species. So the left is a silver-haired bat, and they almost exclusively form their maternity colonies, meaning when they come together as a group to have their babies in the summer, they hang out in tree cavities together and in small hollows. And they're dependent on these old growth forests, and so managing these forests for diverse age structure and for maintaining these snags and things like that has been very beneficial for these species. And on the right, we have a big brown bat. And let's see, these guys, typically, they form their maternity colonies beneath loose bark and small cavities. They will also use buildings, barns, bridges, and bat houses, but you'll find them in trees as well. And that brings up kind of the man-made structures, which bats surprisingly do like lots of man-made structures. This is a photo of the Mexican free-tailed bat. And this bridge that's shown is the YOLO bypass. It's out along Highway 80 near Sacramento. We have this overpass where the expansion joints underneath are just perfectly sized for these Mexican free-tailed bats who like to hang out in there. So it's an amazing bat habitat. And if you're ever driving through that area, I definitely recommend trying to time your drive to pass through in the evening and stopping and watching their emergence. So this is a photo of them coming out from that overpass in the evening. All right, I was going to talk a little bit about echolocation because I do want to talk a little bit more about the work that we've been doing with the North American Bat Monitoring Program. And that work is really dependent on echolocation because what we've been doing is trying to record bats and use the recordings of their echolocation calls. We can identify their species. So, it's a great way to collect a lot of data without too much labor. So we can put out these bat detectors, which are ultrasonic microphones that can listen for their echolocation calls. And we can use those once we record them to identify the species and know a little bit more about which bats are where on the landscape in California. So that's kind of some of the work we've been doing. And I just want to talk a little bit about background of echolocation so that you can understand how that works. So all bats do see. Many also use echolocation. They don't have true night vision. They just have potentially better vision than us in low light. But echolocation is how they navigate and find food in the dark. And just to give a sense, they give out about 10 to 15 calls per second. And they're super short, fast, and loud. And they send out a bunch of these and listen to them bouncing back off objects around them so that they can kind of build a map of what's going on around them as they fly. And you can see in this photo, bat anatomy and physiology has developed to really help them do this effectively. So these three photos, you can just see these huge ears on these bats listening for their echolocation calls coming back to them. This bat on the left is a really cool bat called the spotted bat. And this is a local California bat. It's an interesting one because its echolocation calls are actually low enough frequency that it's audible to humans. So you would be able to hear a spotted bat if it was echolocating and flying past you. In the middle, we have a Townsend's big-eared bat, another super common species in California, or at least widespread, a little bit unknown how common, but it's found all over the state. Again, just huge ears to hear those echolocation calls. And this last one on the right is the California leaf-nosed bat. And these bats mostly live in Southern California, but leaf-nosed bats are kind of interesting. I'll zoom in on it so you can see a little bit better his face. You can see his little leaf nose kind of poking up. And these leaf-nosed bats are interesting because they echolocate, they actually produce the sound through their nose instead of through their mouth. So when they make their sound that's going to bounce back to them, they push it out of their nose there through its leaf nose rather than through its mouth. So it's interesting. Let's see, this just gives you a little bit of a sense of how bats are typically operating. They have a better hearing range than we do, which is why we often don't hear their echolocation calls. So you can see that their hearing frequency just extends much further to the right to higher frequencies than most other mammals. So that's why we're not able to hear their echolocation calls most of the time, and why we need these special ultrasonic microphones to record bat echolocation calls. And this is, I just wanted to mention that bats emit calls as low as 50 decibels. So 50 decibels, you can look on this little chart here. It's somewhere between our normal talking voices and a refrigerator. So not crazy loud, but they can emit sounds as high as 140 decibels. And if you look where 140 is on this chart, it's right around the jet engine taking off there. So that would be like louder than holding a smoke detector up, right next to your ear and turning it on. And, bats, like I said, they need to have good hearing to hear their calls come back to them. And so if they were to scream that loudly when they were doing their echolocation calls, they could deafen themselves. And their workaround for this is they have these middle ear bones that they can almost fully dislocate. when they go to echolocate. So they use a small muscle to pull these middle ear bones out of alignment, so that when they make those calls, they don't deafen themselves, which is pretty wild. Let's see. This is kind of interesting. Bats, depending on their habitat, they will adjust their echolocation calls, which shouldn't be too surprising, I suppose. But if they're in a dense forest, like shown on the left, you can see example sonogram of their call frequency and time. And you can see they make a lot of calls and they're pretty short in those dense areas. And then as you move into these more open areas, you can see on the right there, longer, more spaced out calls, just because there's less things they need to navigate around, which totally makes sense. I'd say an interesting piece that goes along with that is that body size also changes with these bats. So their body size tends to increase depending on the habitat they use. As it becomes less and less cluttered, you see bigger and bigger bats. So in those like tight forested areas, you're going to see smaller bats that echolocate faster and more frequently, so that they can navigate that cluttered and like dense area. And then on the right, we see those spread out calls from the bigger bat. And this just gives a sense of some of the different calls a bat will use. So as they're kind of just cruising through the landscape, maybe they're, flying up some corridor through like a open meadow or a ravine or something, looking for the place that they want to feed, they'll use this search phase call. And then as they find something they're actually interested in, they use this approach phase, more frequent call. And then lastly, this terminal buzz phase is as they approach an insect, they're bouncing calls off, say, a moth, faster and faster as they get closer to it, so that they can catch its every little micro movement until they feed on it. And in terms of my work identifying these species by call, we have to catch these bats in this approach phase, because it's as they go into the terminal buzz phase, all the species calls can look very similar to one another. And so that's something that's unique about bats, and trying to identify them based on their echolocation calls, as opposed to identifying a bird based on its bird song, is that bats are using this echolocation call constantly, and they use it in tons of different scenarios. So there's a ton of variability in it, and there can be a ton of overlap in terms of how the calls look for different species. So it can be really hard to identify to the species level. So part of it is catching the right type of call, that approach phase call, where different species will tend to look a little bit more different. And then as you get into that terminal buzz phase, all bat species are going to look pretty similar. Let's see if I can get the next slide here. So this is an example sonogram of what their calls can look like. And we see the frequency on the left, and this is time as you look left to right. And so each of these little kind of hockey stick shaped red lines are their echolocation calls, and that feeding buzz that I've outlined is kind of as they get closer and closer to a piece of prey, for instance, they'll start echolocating faster and faster to kind of keep tabs on that thing. All right. I do want to talk briefly about threats to bats, because this is the big motivator for the work that I'm doing, and the reason why we need to understand more about bats is that we know that there are these threats and these things that are these challenges they're facing, and we don't really know how much of an effect it's having, and we're still coming up with solutions. How do we deal with these things? So wind energy is one that has been killing migratory bats, and this primarily kills tree bats, so these bats that roost in trees, which tend to migrate long distances. So a lot of these mortalities are happening during that migration phase where bats are traveling together. And it's, it can be collisions. It can also be rapid pressure changes near the end of these blades that cause the bats to have problems flying, or even to have, in some cases, it can damage their internal organs if there's extreme pressure changes. So yeah, these wind turbines can be very fatal to bats. People are looking into ways to kind of mitigate this. I will show this bat in particular is a local bat called the hoary bat, another bat that's widespread, found in a lot of places, but not necessarily, we're not sure how its population is doing overall. So this is a local species that's been impacted by wind, lots of mortalities, and we have shown hoary bat declines associated with wind energy development. And so we have to ask ourselves, California, there's a ton of opportunity for wind energy development, which is great. It's a renewable, clean energy. And the question is, how do we do that development and make sure we're taking the steps needed so that it's not also having this adverse impact that we don't intend. And so sadly, these are some photos of, bats from counts and monitoring underneath wind turbines. And that's a hoary bat on the right. And on the left is a local bat species called a red bat, another affected species from wind energy development. Another big threat to bats that you've maybe heard about is this fungal disease called white nose syndrome. It's been a huge problem on the East Coast. Let's see, I'll show this map, which shows white nose syndrome occurrences in the US. And you can see there's just been a ton of, it's spread widely through the East Coast. On the West Coast, it's still hasn't fully established itself, but we've had our first detections of white nose syndrome in California just in the last year or two. So we're kind of on the front lines of seeing how is this thing going to affect our bat species. And the way it works is the white nose syndrome, the fungus develops on the faces of hibernating bats as they're sleeping. And so at some point it builds up enough that it disrupts their hibernation and wakes them up. And it takes a lot of energy to come in and out of hibernation. So they end up going out foraging for food and burning a bunch of energy in the winter when they can't afford it. And typically just dying from starvation or a lack of, fat deposits and that sort of thing to be able to survive the winter. So it's interesting because it mostly affects these bat species that winter in these big winter colonies, which we call hibernaculum. So it's a little bit unknown what's going to happen to the bat species of California, partly because we don't have as many large known hibernaculum. We don't have these huge caves where tons and tons of bats go to spend their winter. And so it's possible that our bat species might fare better, which is optimistic, and hopefully that proves to be the case. But I would say it's also, we just don't know exactly what our bat species do in the winter. We don't know exactly where they go and where they migrate to. And so again, this is one of the big motivating factors behind the work that I'm doing with the North American Bat Monitoring Program. And I'll just talk briefly about that and then I'm going to wrap up here and we can have some questions. But the North American Bat Monitoring Program is a USGS-led program. So it's the US Geological Survey. And essentially what it does is it's created this grid across all of North America. And you can see these blue squares on this map. And so they've blanketed all of North America in these grid squares, and they can use that to then randomly select which grid squares we're going to survey. And what that lets us do is we can sample, we don't have to sample every single grid square to get a sense of what's going on the landscape as a whole, because we can use statistical inference because it was a randomly selected sample to try to understand what's going on in these cells we're not surveying, what's the likelihood of finding certain species there. So we can do some of this occupancy modeling where we extrapolate using the data we did collect to guess based on that data, what's the likelihood we're going to find this bat species in surrounding cells. So yeah, the mission here, provide architecture for coordinated bat monitoring to support local, regional, and range-wide inferences about trends in bat distributions and abundances. And, seeing that map of white nose syndrome starting to unfold on the California landscape, it feels obvious to me that better monitoring of bats and understanding where they're going, how are their populations doing as this thing starts to take hold, is going to be super valuable. And then more importantly, in terms of moving past the disease, as we start to manage bat species and apply certain treatments and conservation approaches in different areas, have a better sense of, is that working? Is that doing what we want it to do? These are some of those questions that NABAT is trying to help address. So like we were talking about, what species are most vulnerable to white nose syndrome, but also how many bats are there, where are they? Should a certain species be listed under the Endangered Species Act? are populations shrinking or relocating? And what does species recovery look like? Are our conservation approaches working? That kind of question. And the last thing I'll share is an example of, we've been collecting data now for the last, the North American Bat Monitoring Program has existed for the last 5 years or so. And data collection has been more consistent in some areas than others, but we're getting to the point now where we have multiple years of data to start being able to use. So this is an example study coming out of the data. This is Oregon and Washington, these two maps, looking at the hoary bat, which we were talking about, was the bat affected by wind energy development, but looking at population changes in hoary bats across the states of Oregon and Washington. And they were able to document these areas of decline, and those black dots in this instance are wind turbines. So you can kind of get a sense of, we can see, are those mapping on to these pockets where we're seeing negative changes in hoary bat population. So it's cool to see the data starting to be used from the North American Bat Monitoring Program, and hopefully more and more studies like this will start to come out so that we can start working to conserve these bat species. And I think I'm going to call it there and say thank you so much to Coastside Land Trust for having me. And I'm happy to answer questions that I can. And I will also say I'm happy to talk more about bats, ways to get involved, all those sorts of things. If anyone's interested, I put my email up on this slide, and goodbye@batcon.org. And I'd be happy to hear from folks about questions. And also if you're interested in, getting involved with bats or with us or all those things. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Nat. Well, I have a few questions, a real variety of questions. One of the first questions was asked was why the bats hang upside down.
Oh, nice. That's a great question. I don't know that I have a good answer other than it's probably one of those things that, has evolved from the habitats they use. Roosting in caves, obviously, caves can just be wet and hard to exist on the floor. And that would be my guess, is that probably it came as a result of these habitats that they're using. But it's a great question. Yeah.
And then the next person was asking about predators, main bat predators.
Oh, main bat predators. Let's see. Yeah, well, I think in those threats to bats, we talked about a couple of those predators being wind turbines and this fungal disease. Those are the things driving population changes. In terms of things eating bats, humans, we are one that we do predate on bats, and that's been that's a whole other conversation about the impacts that's had on our relationship with bats and kind of the zoonotic disease transfer and that sort of thing. But not a ton of animals are going to go in and eat a bat, straight out, like a live bat out of a cave or something like that. I think there's probably opportunistic scavenging that happens from bats that die and fall to the ground. But yeah, I would say I don't know that I could name a primary predator in California other than these threats to bats that we have been bringing about.
Okay.
Yeah.
The wind turbine. Yeah, someone was asking that question, actually. They were saying, okay, if a bat can echolocate to find something as small as a tiny insect, why don't they have the capability to see and not hit a wind turbine?
Yeah. Well, partly, so there is the pressure change thing I mentioned, that some of the mortalities can be caused by this pressure change that happens around wind turbines. And, something that's interesting about it is that we think of them, especially these giant wind turbines, as being really slow, right? They're so huge, they don't move that fast. And to our eye, it does look that way. But because they're so huge, out near the tip of those turbines, you can imagine that close into the turbine, it's moving quite slowly as it goes around that smaller circle radius. But with these giant wind turbines, that tip of that thing is flying. I don't have a number off the top of my head about how fast those are going, but even if they look slow to us, they can be moving extremely fast. So I think that can catch bats by surprise. And I think there's also, there's some speculation. There haven't been good studies about this, about whether, are bats trying to roost on these turbines or something? And is that how they're getting killed? Because like I mentioned, a lot of the species being affected are these tree roosting species. So are they somehow mistaking it for a tree? And then, is there a mechanism where they're somehow being killed that way? So there's a little bit of speculation about that. I think there can be noises that disrupt their ability to receive their echolocation calls. So that's been another question and kind of focus of research is, are these wind turbines creating some noise that's messing up their echolocation? Some ultrasonic frequency that we're not hearing that's messing with the bat's ability to track that wind turbine. So that's kind of an active question. I think there has been some positive research to show that putting certain sound deterrents on wind turbines can keep bats away from them. So if we basically blast certain ultrasonic sounds from the wind turbines, maybe that helps bats avoid them and not navigate towards them. So it's somewhat promising, but again, it's just kind of early stages of figuring that out. And these are things that we've only started to notice recently as wind has really scaled up, like that we've started to see those impacts on bats. So yeah.
Same person who had asked another really good question earlier said, wind turbine tip, 120 miles per hour.
Nice. Yeah, right. Flying, which we do. Our fastest, that Mexican free-tailed bat can go, I think, almost 100, which is pretty amazing. They're very fast, but yeah, that's amazing. 120 miles.
Okay, how many species do we have here? Did you speak to this? How many species we have in Central California?
We have 25 species in California. Let's see, I would imagine maybe like, they're so habitat, they like certain habitats in some ways. So it's kind of like if you were to go up into, say, like, the Sierra foothills to a little bit higher elevation, you might find a like different kind of swath of species. And I would guess, just based on our sampling and what we've been seeing, that there's probably like, a given area would have 5 to 12 or 15 of those species in kind of like Central California coast area. So we've done, I would have to ask, I don't know if anyone knows the organization One Tam. They've been doing a lot of monitoring kind of just north of San Mateo County, and they would probably have some good information about what species they've been detecting. But we've been doing some sampling south of there, like in Santa Cruz County, and yeah, I think we've had anywhere from 4 to 10 species on those sites.
Are you using the MODIS towers to monitor the bat migrations?
Some of our partners are. So we are hoping to incorporate that into the North American Bat Monitoring Program. I'm not personally like working on getting MODIS towers up at the moment. For folks who don't know, it's basically like, it's a standing stationary tower. And if you put radio tracking tags on the bats, as they fly by, you can kind of count, get registered occurrences of those bats. So it is a super promising way to monitor these wildlife that fly and move around across big swaths of land. So birds and bats, but even, like large far roaming predators. There's a lot of potential there for sure to better monitor like how they're moving across the landscape. And so I know that the USGS has some MODIS efforts. The Park Service has some MODIS efforts in California. And it's really just a matter of, it's hard to scale up. Like putting one MODIS tower up is not that useful. It can be, but really, like, as you get more and more towers, it becomes exponentially more informative about what's going on. And so it's been a hard thing to get enough like capital investment to get like the needed infrastructure, because it's kind of expensive. So I'm optimistic that stuff will grow, but it's been slow for that reason of like, how do we all come together like through these collaborations and partnerships with all these different agencies and organizations to make that money happen, to actually get the network we need for it to be useful.
Yeah. So many players involved.
Yeah.
So the quick question about, so someone was asking about, safety, and obviously that's something we're not getting too deep into right now with about the ecology, but that they have a lot of bats in their area, and they've got a lot of bat droppings on their decking area and all around, and wondering if is something to be worried about with their animals, their cats and dogs and things like that.
It's a good question. I think typically bats are not going to bother you if you don't bother them. tons of people coexist with their bats and their pets, you know, in a barn or an overhang on their house or in a bat house nearby on their property or that sort of thing. So I would say, you know, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I
She's more
think
worried about, or she was talking about the droppings on the deck.
I see. Yeah,
Yeah.
I see. Yeah. Well, other than being, you know, a little messy, I don't think there's much to worry about there. In terms of, you know, like I would say like rabies has been the big disease transfer worry with bats. And, you know, like I said, if you're not bothering the bats, they're not going to bother you on that front. You know, you can, lots of good, if you want to reach out to me at that email, I'm happy to connect folks with like, I know there's lots of biologists throughout California that would be happy to come just look at a property and say, you know, oh, cool, like this is the kind of bat species you have, or, you know, things you should think about. And I think there's also California Department of Fish and Wildlife has some really good resources about coexisting with bats. And another effort they're working on is trying to map bat colonies better and understand where the bat colonies are. So they have a report bat colonies kind of website where they're taking citizen sourced, like if you know where a bat colony is and want to report its location so that they can know about it and help. They're very conservation minded. This is the non-game branch of Fish and Wildlife, so that they're working to conserve those species. Maybe Kate, maybe we can put a link to some of those resources, you know, when we post the webinar. I can send you a couple links for some more information about that kind of thing, about coexisting with bats. Yeah.
Thank you. That would be, I think people would really like to see that, especially as a lot of folks that are tuning into this are the very people that would like to be involved in that city.
Yeah, good. Nice.
Yeah. And then, well, another question that we might be able to include later too, Hillary was asking, I want to install a bat house at our place. What's the best placement, design, features that I should make sure to get? She said she lives in the Honda, and what species can she expect to see around her home? Which sounds like there could be a number. And she said she's seen them around their house for several years. Is that something
Nice.
or should we do it like we could send it as a link to share a little bit more about it?
About the bat houses. Well, let's see. I'll mention that Bat Conservation International's website, so batcon.org. That website has really good species profiles. So it lets you kind of filter to the US level. And then let's see, I can't remember if we have a filter for states, but even if we don't, you can see those. I think we do. You can filter down to California, and then we have some range maps on there with those species profiles. So you can kind of look through those California species and see which ones you would expect to find in your area. So that can be a good place to start. And yeah, there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of good info out there about bat houses. I can see if I can pick out a couple links that we can share that would be the best. I think, you know, one thing that folks don't think about is the temperature regulation for these bat houses. So that's one thing we were seeing, especially in like, you know, recent heat waves and stuff, was bats falling dead out of bat boxes because they weren't well insulated enough, or they were sited in an area that was just, you know, like south facing, extremely exposed, that sort of thing. So there's a little bit of like consideration there to just make sure the bats are, you know, can use that space consistently, and there's not going to be huge fluctuations, because when bats look for habitat, they're looking for cold, consistent, you know, kind of quiet areas to hunker down for a little bit. And so, you know, we're trying to provide that as best we can with a bat box, but lots of good information out there. And maybe we can try to find a link that's the most helpful.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
There are some great questions on here. So I'll send these to you kind of as both, or ask you these both. So this person, there's two different people, Michelle and Bill. One was saying, do the insects hear that terminal buzz phase? And then the other question that Michelle had was, do the bats ever confuse other bats' calls? So can you speak to the calls and whether insects hear them or whether bats get confused with, you know, like you were saying, that sometimes as they get to that terminal phase, they can sound similar.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that in both of those ways?
Yeah, let's see. Can I stop screen sharing? Is it okay if I just?
Sure, yeah.
I feel like show my face rather than the screen.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, one thing about the bats confusing echolocation calls amongst each other, I'm sure it happens. I'm sure that is tricky. And one thing you'll notice is that bats are really the most active at kind of dawn and dusk. So, you know, when we record calls through the night, we see a big drop off after the first couple hours of the night, and then it picks back up for the couple hours before dawn. And, I think part of that is them using a combination of echolocation and their eyesight to be able to kind of deal with that problem of like, for the most part, they might go foraging on their own and they don't have to worry about that. But when they're, say, flying out of that YOLO causeway, like I was showing, like a big emergence from an area and there's tons of bats around, like, yeah, they come out a little before dark, probably, I would imagine, partly for that reason, so that they don't have to worry too much about confusing each other's calls. And as far as the insect question goes, I don't know, but I'm sure that's terrifying if you're a moth and you hear that closing in on you.
Especially if they're traveling real fast. Yeah. Lynn is asking about what can suburban folks do to encourage bat resilience? Great question.
Ooh, it's a great question. You can, like, bat boxes are a good place to start if you do have the space. Like I said, providing that habitat's great. Let's see. I don't know. I would say it's a lot. It's largely like a matter of us being aware of, altering those habitats that bats might be using, right? And so I know that might not help the homeowner too much, but it is. I think I saw someone in the chat asking about like removing trees and whether there's timing for that and how to consider bats. And I think thinking about those things is useful because like sometimes bats might be using trees to roost in a suburban area. And we don't know it because it's not one of those maternity colonies, say, where there's tons of bats hanging out and you can tell that there's like, oh, there's so much guano. But maybe bats are using it as kind of just a day roosting spot to hang out. Like that is common that bats, will move around and pick their own kind of like one or two bats will day roost. You see this with Townsend's big-eared bats, for instance, that they'll kind of hang out in different areas by themselves during the day and then come together in these big maternity colonies. But what that means is like sometimes we miss that bats are even present because you're not going to know, there's not a huge pile of guano and all this stuff, but that bat might be using your tree more than you think. So I think before removing trees and kind of altering habitat like that, I think it's worth like talking with a biologist who'd come and look and say like, is there a chance bats are using that? Is there a way we can mitigate it so we remove it at the right time so that we're not disturbing the bat or that sort of thing?
Okay. Yeah, actually, Lynette was asking, she was talking about specifically about trees, actually, because she said she lives in Daly City near the BART station.
Okay.
And she's she at around 6:30 p.m. she sees the bats fly over her backyard, and they always, she says, they always seem to come from the south and fly north, and many circle around a big Monterey cypress tree in the corner of the yard, then usually head west or north after that. She said, I wonder what species this might be and where they might be coming from, where they live, and whether the area around a large tree also is especially good for insects.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting. I can't say like based on, where they're approaching from, what species I think it might be, but it does point to the fact that there might be kind of a larger colony or roost right nearby somewhere that they're all coming from that direction consistently.
Okay.
And yeah, I do think the trees and insects thing is real for sure. Obviously, like lots of insects, we see woodpeckers going after them deep in the bark, and we know that insects do like trees. I think consistently like water is the most attractive thing for bats. It's just the cloud of insects around water tends to be like very consistent, but trees definitely like they're going to be attracted to those areas. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this, but just with some of these questions, because when we were talking to you prior to this webinar, you were talking about why you got into this to begin with, and this idea that, I mean, it matters very much what species you're studying, but it also, I mean, just the interconnectedness of it all, whatever your lens is, whether you're coming in from bats or you're coming in from insects. And a couple of other people are asking questions about, well, the relationship to insect populations, right? And that connection to bats, and how do we kind of tease out how is that affecting a bat population? And it's got to be such an interesting time to be in the field where you are, with specifically talking about bats, which are pretty underrepresented in terms of historical study, and then you are to be thinking like you're trying to catch up in a time where there's so many variables that are overlapping and changing so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a challenge in ecology, right? It's just disentangling all the different things that could be happening. But yeah, it's cool. I think, we talked about the Modus towers, and I think this acoustic monitoring as well. It's like, it's cool to see these technologies coming online that are letting us get that landscape scale picture of what's going on in terms of, species movement and, population kind of trends. So I think that's going to be huge for bats in terms of just understanding what's going on with them. And so even like those ecology questions of where are they hanging out? Where are they migrating to? We didn't even talk about climate change, but obviously that's going to start to affect bat migration patterns. And it's a question of how. And yeah, it's cool to see these technologies coming online. I think, I didn't really get into this in the presentation, but some of the challenges of using that acoustic monitoring to identify bat species and just, it's so easy to go and put a bunch of recorders out and then we get this mess of data. We can collect so much data so quickly. And this is a problem in like all areas of the world right now, right? Like in all parts of our lives, we can just collect too much data. And then it's like, well, how do you even make sense of this or use this? And, we have been trying to use some of these software programs that can auto-identify species, but they're still just not good enough to trust, really. Mm-hmm. And it's this interesting thing where we build these, machine learning type algorithms that can identify species, but all of that stuff is based on probabilities, right? And what we're really interested in as ecologists is like some of these rare and difficult to find species. And that's kind of true across the board in ecology of like, we want to pay attention to these species that are hard to find. But the reality is when you use those machine learning programs, those are the species that get cut out, right? Because it's all based on probability. So it's like the likelihood of it being that rare thing, the computer's going to say it's not that thing. So it's still just like a ton of manpower to try to go through all those calls and make sure we're actually putting eyes on those echolocation calls, like the spectrograms that I was showing. Because, somebody who knows the area on the bats can do a better job of differentiating based on the call what species that is. And we're kind of in this stage of like, now it's so easy to collect data, but how do we even make use of it? So I do think that'll start to help answer those questions. But yeah, very hard to disentangle some of those kind of causal factors in ecology for sure.
Yeah. Just because a number of people asked specifically about flying foxes, can you speak to flying foxes? The Philippine, the golden crown flying fox, but just in flying fox in general, someone was asking, can you sort of define what a flying fox is?
I can't speak too much to them. I would love to see one day. I definitely recommend traveling to see them. They look amazing. Yeah, I mean, interesting in the sense that you can see them out during the day, right? Like very obvious in that tree roosting. That's pretty unique for them. And it's cool seeing such a big species being a fruit-eating bat. I think, there's so much fear of bats. That video I showed of the running bat right at the beginning of the bat kind of like running across the ground is a vampire bat. I don't know if I even mentioned that because they have such a stigma, but I do love that these flying foxes are just these giant like fruit munchers, peaceful giants. But yeah, I wish I had better information about flying foxes, but I haven't been lucky enough to get yet.
It's just, I think that's what's so cool about these community webinars. We come in with such different backgrounds, and I love that. I mean, and we all are so grateful that people are coming in with questions from the people that have been studying bats for a little while to people that are just figuring out like, is a flying fox even a bat? Or right, like all of these things are a part of the learning wherever we're coming in from. Yeah. Michelle was sharing that the Oakland Zoo has a Malayan flying fox.
Oh, cool. Nice.
Yeah. Okay, so just before we leave, a number of you asked like a little bit more of specific questions, and thank you to a number of you who are asking about more of the monitoring. Laura, Amelia was talking about sort of how we can help with prevention of endangerment and things like that. And I think we can share some of that in the links at the end. I think it sounded like you've already mentioned some great links that we will definitely share in our follow-up email. And I apologize to anyone who didn't get your question answered. It sounds like, Nat, you'd be willing to, if they have something specific, to reach out to you.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay.
And I will mention that, our hope is that we're kind of in the pilot phase of this, what we're calling backyard bat surveys right now, which is, ideally, we're going to have some kits where we ship, if you're a landowner, or even if you don't own the land, you just live somewhere, and want to participate in bat monitoring, we would ship you a detector, and you could put it out in your yard and upload the data. And it would have been great to come here and be like, just let me know and I'll send it to you. But it's still just in the pilot phase. So we're kind of doing a first run of it this year. But I can definitely, as that evolves, I'll definitely be reaching back out through channels like this to try to get people to participate. So
Awesome.
I'm hopeful that either this summer or next, for our kind of maternity season monitoring, we'll be inviting more people to participate in that way. Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe let's stay in really good contact between the Coastside Land Trust and your organization. I think these are exactly the type of people that would be wonderful to connect.
Totally.
That. All right. Well, thank you, Nat. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful presentation. And I know it got a lot of people thinking.
Nice. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here, and we really appreciate those of you all of you who have continued to support the Coastside Land Trust, both in donation, which obviously allows these kind of things to continue, and projects like the Junior Land Stewards Program, which is back up and running and in the field. Even on a rainy week, they've been out there, and kids are getting out there in the field and getting tarping some of the land where they're going to be doing their native pollinator plant gardens, and stewardship is back on, and people are out there doing good work. So thank you to those of you who have continued to support the Coastside Land Trust in many, many ways. And thank you to people like you, Nat, who come in and share and allow us all to connect in a much deeper way with what's going on around us. We have in a couple of weeks, under a month, we have a great talk from Feel a Day Fund, and they're going to be talking about wildcats in the area too. So keep your eyes out, folks, about that you'll be coming in as an email. So register for that. Remember, you can always register, even if you don't know you'll for sure be able to make it, because then you can at least get the recording. If you don't do that already, if that's not your style, I would highly recommend that, because then you can watch things anytime, and it's better to be in person, because then you can ask questions and you get to really be part of the experience. But if you question it, register anyway and get the recording. Share it. And this recording, Nat's recording, will come to you in the next couple of days here with a bunch of good links. So watch the recording, share the recording. This is a great time of year to be sharing this type of recording, and sharing this information with other folks, and getting the word out about some of the work that VACON is doing. There's a lot. Hopefully you guys will connect and really see some of the work and how you can be part of it. Thanks for the great questions. So we will see a number of you in a few weeks. And thank you again, Nat, and have a wonderful weekend. Bye, everybody.